Quad 66. I really thought that this weekend I was going to be finishing a video and launching these Warpig Zero canopies, and thought I was there, but I got one last kind of test cut. I'm really glad I did, because the frame material came in just way thinner. I shouldn't say way thinner. I think you would be hard pressed to notice the difference unless you were doing something like this, where you're relying on tight tolerances to get two carbon fiber parts to fit together in a meaningful way. So instead of that, what we're doing here is bringing you an alternate video, and this is something I thought I'd try in the meantime, just kind of keep testing stuff out. So this is the 90 frames per second, and I'm flying on a 3-inch, which I think is what you really want to do if you are trying to carry around this bigger camera. But instead of flying the 1204 motors, I'm on the 1104s and giving it a try. So this is okay. This is my first time flying this build, and my question here is whether what I like about the 1104 builds is the 2.5-inch props, or if it's really the 1104 motors that I like, and they'll work on more than one prop, and in this case the Genvan 3016. So what's funny enough about this is, so I just put on this camera, this is the 90 frames per second camera, and just before this camera I was flying the little nano little Whoop camera. There we go. Finally got it. And it was funny, I put on that camera on this build, and like I nailed that little thing right there, that little sequence of split S into the power loop, like right off the bat. It was just funny because of how much I struggled with trying to do that on the other setup, where on the 2.5-inch props I just couldn't get it. Just the timing felt off. But I feel like even with this lens, there's more fisheye here. I do have the lenses on the way, so hopefully we'll get those upgrade lenses and get to try that out. But in the meantime, here's just a little flight footage. So I'm going to bring this down, and I'm going to take you to the bench, and I'll show you kind of the tolerance issues I've been struggling with. And I'll give you a little update on that. I think I have to make a substantive change, but I'll show you that on the bench. All right. Here's the quad that I was flying in this DVR footage. It's a Warpig 122 frame, 3mm, with the Zero canopy. And specifically, I was using it to try and find the platform that I like to carry around this 90 frame per second camera. So with the analog build, which is the slightly smaller frame with the 2.5-inch props, this is the build I really like. The Avan props, Avan Rush props, 2.5-inch, and this thing just absolutely rips at this lighter weight. Once we go up to HD Zero, I really feel like the tipping point is somewhere around this build, where I'm using that Whoop nano camera. And this, to me, still feels okay. It's definitely not as lively as the analog build, but it still feels tolerable. But I feel like it just gets over a tipping point once we go to the bigger camera, to where it just becomes kind of, it's just underwhelming in terms of power. So on the 3-inch with the 1204 motors, I felt like it was kind of unwieldy, but I said, well, what happens if I overprop? Let's put some smaller motors on there. So I threw the T-Motor 1104s that I use for 2.5 inch. And it's actually with the Gemfan 3016 props, and I actually like it. I think it's the go-to for specifically for the 90 frames per second camera, doing a full, doing the digital build. Now, of course, as soon as I like something, something has to go wrong, okay? And so what happened with these motors? What went wrong? Well, T-Motor already uses these pretty short motor shafts. They decided that not only do they want to make them short, at least in this batch, they also decided they want to make them really narrow. And the problem with that is even with tight-fitting props, I've been getting them so even with normally tight-fitting props, this is so loose that there's just no friction being provided by that prop shaft at all. And the problem with that is that that leaves all the force. Anytime you touch a prop to the ground, a little crash or anything, all that force goes straight into the nylon prop screws, and they start to break pretty easily. The nylon prop screws, they need some help from a press fit prop to have some resistance to those forces so they don't break so easily. So unfortunately on this latest batch, I'm getting a lot of prop screw breakage, and that's kind of a pain. And it's not just breaking the screws and you have to replace them, it's also breaking the screws and props basically popping off too easily, and then you go and crash because the prop came off from a touch. So that's kind of an issue. I don't know if that's going to be true for ongoing batches and things, but be aware of that if you're interested in these motors. So the other thing that's frustrating, and part of the reason I've been doing all this extra trying different platforms, is because of the frame issues. So this in 3mm and that in 4mm with the 0 cages. These were supposed to be like the final test cuts. The problem is, and this is a known issue, when you're doing this type of a design where you're relying on kind of this to snug in on the frame, you've got two things working against you. One is that when you mill this out, there's going to be some variability in how tight they can make the tolerances. At CNC Madness, Nick thinks he can keep it to within 0.1, which sounds pretty reasonable, I think. But between things kind of moving a little bit and the bits wearing down and things like that, there's only so tight of a tolerance they can maintain. The other thing, though, that also introduces variability is how thick the frames actually are. So when we say that we're buying or using 3mm or 4mm, we're more like we're saying, well, approximately 3mm and approximately 4mm. And unfortunately, these latest ones came in so thin that, and it's not thin like this is crazy thin for 3mm, but when we're talking about the tolerances we need to go ahead and do this style of a clip-on sort of cage, this needs to be a good bit tighter than it is, and you can see that this just flops around, and more importantly, that flopping around, it will shift. I don't know if you can see that, but this will shift up and down quite a bit. You can probably see that right there. It's shifting up and down. So I knew that was an issue going into it, and so because Nick kind of warned me about that beforehand. And so that's part of the reason that what we do is we taper this back and pinch in on here, because we're relying on the flex in the carbon fiber to take up that slack, because we know we can't get the tolerances perfect. So instead what we're doing is we're squeezing things and relying on the bend to kind of pull everything together. And we're using multiple points to snug things up, where most of these have been building up super, super, super sturdy. And with this latest cut, once I have all the pieces in, although the box is pretty rigid, it just moves too much for it to be what I would consider tolerable. And so I'm glad I got this last test cut rather than releasing, because I would have felt really awful if people bought that and that was the result that they got. That would have created kind of a not great situation. So the answers of what to do, one of the things you could do is you could just throw a couple layers of tape on here and build this up, but that seems just kind of like a janky solution. I think the solution I want to go with is say, well, what we can do is just say, hey, given the limitations of what we can do and control, these are just going to have to be hand-finished frames in that what I need to do is bring these little dog bone holes in just 1/10 on either side, which will create more material, a tighter fit, and that you'll just have to take a little sandpaper and take a tiny 1/10 off of there and there, either sandpaper or a little file, and hand fit it so that you get a nice interface when you assemble it. Now it doesn't have to be like super perfect, because as I said, I'm using on the flex, but it just can't be. It can't be quite this floppy. This just gets too floppy. Where actually the 4mm wasn't. The 4mm is probably passable once it all built up, but the 3mm test that I had here, this one just did not pass. You can see how much that one just moves just too much. That just didn't. I just didn't find it acceptable. So that was super frustrating, because I really wanted to get these kind of launched and out there. So I think it's a simple enough solution on this 4mm, because we've got the limiter on how close we can bring these dog bone holes together is this little center portion right in the middle, because that rests against the front, and but there's enough material here to where when we bring those dog bone holes in, that center thing, little platform, is going to narrow down, but not by a meaningful amount. The 3mm, on the other hand, I'm a little bit concerned, because you can see how narrow that little center section is between the dog bones. And if we take 1/10 off of that on either side, that's like 2/10 less. We're getting down into like just 1mm left of material, which makes me a little bit concerned. So I got to chat with Nick and see, I don't know, what's the absolute minimum we can do on like bit size, milling bit size, and see what we can accomplish there. Let me know your thoughts on that. I feel like this thing's like, this is starting to feel like my white whale. Or I don't know if it's gonna sink me and my reputation if I don't get it right. But I want to get it out there, and I want to get something out there rather than just abandoning it altogether, because if it works right, it works right. It works pretty well. All right, well, that's the update. Till next time, cheers.